The Hidden History of Japan's Imperial Dynasty. 2,600 years of power. For more than 2 millennia, one royal line has remained at the center of a nation's identity, politics, religion, and cultural evolution. From mythic beginnings rooted in divine descent to the modern constitutional monarchy of today, the Imperial House of Japan stands as the longest continuous hereditary monarchy in recorded human history. But behind this extraordinary continuity lies a far more complex and hidden story, one filled with myth, war, survival, political manipulation, spiritual authority, and moments where the throne nearly vanished from history entirely. This is not just the story of emperors. This is the story of survival across 2,600 years, and it begins not with history, but with mythology, the divine origin. When history becomes myth. In ancient Japanese tradition, the imperial line does not begin with a man, but with a god. The earliest chronicles, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, describe a celestial origin story. At the center stands the sun goddess Amaterasu, who is said to have sent her descendant to Earth to rule the islands of Japan. This divine descendant becomes the foundation of the imperial bloodline. According to tradition, this lineage leads directly to Emperor Jimmu, the first emperor of Japan, who is said to have ascended the throne in 660 BCE. From a modern historical perspective, these accounts blend myth and political legitimacy. But in ancient times, myth was legitimacy. The emperor was not merely a ruler, he was a living symbol of divine order, a bridge between heaven and earth. This belief would become one of the strongest political forces in Japanese history, because when a ruler is considered divine, overthrowing him is not just rebellion, it is blasphemy. The early Yamato state power before the emperor. Long before centralized imperial rule, Japan was a fragmented land of clans. Power was distributed among regional chieftains, each controlling their own territory, rituals, and military forces. Over time, one clan rose above the rest. The Yamato clan. The Yamato established a loose political structure that gradually unified parts of central Japan. They adopted Chinese administrative systems, writing, and political philosophy, but adapted them to local traditions. The emperor in these early centuries was not an absolute ruler. Instead, he was a sacred figurehead surrounded by powerful aristocratic families who actually controlled military and political power. Even at this early stage, a pattern emerges that will repeat throughout Japanese history. The emperor is eternal, but power is not. The influence of China and Korea borrowed empire systems. As Japan developed, it looked outward for inspiration, particularly to the great dynasties of China and the kingdoms of the Korean peninsula. From China, Japan adopted a bureaucratic government structure, written language adaptation kanji, legal codes imperial court rituals. From Korea, it received early cultural transmission of Buddhism and technological advances. However, Japan did not simply copy these systems, it reshaped them into something uniquely its own. The emperor remained at the center. But unlike China, Japan never fully replaced its imperial line with competing dynasties. Instead, power shifted around the emperor rather than replacing him. This is one of the most unique political patterns in world history. A throne that survives even when it loses control. The rise of the aristocrats when the emperor becomes symbolic. By the Heian period, 794 to 1185, real political power had largely moved away from the emperor. The imperial court in Kyoto became a center of culture, poetry, ritual, and refinement. But behind the scenes, aristocratic families, especially the Fujiwara clan, controlled governance through strategic marriage politics. The Fujiwara perfected a system of influence. Instead of taking the throne, they placed their daughters as imperial consorts, ensuring that future emperors were their blood relatives. In this way, they ruled through the emperor without replacing him. The emperor remained sacred, untouchable, and central, but increasingly powerless in practical governance. This separation between symbolic authority and real political control would define Japan for centuries. The first major shift: the emergence of the warrior class. While the imperial court became refined and ceremonial, a new force was rising in the countryside. Local landowners began building private armies to protect their estates. These warriors evolved into a new social class, the samurai. At first, samurai served aristocrats in Kyoto. But over time, their loyalty shifted toward military strength rather than courtly prestige. This change marked a turning point in Japanese history, because for the first time, power was no longer tied to noble birth or imperial favor alone. It was tied to military force. And military force was rising outside the capital. The Genpei War, the collapse of court power. By the late 12th century, two powerful samurai clans emerged, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry escalated into a national civil war known as the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185. Cities burned. Clans were destroyed. The imperial court in Kyoto lost control over the country entirely. The Minamoto clan emerged victorious under Minamoto no Yoritomo. But instead of restoring imperial power, Yoritomo did something revolutionary. He created a new political system, the birth of the shogunate dual power in Japan. In 1192, Yoritomo was appointed shogun, military ruler of Japan. This marked the beginning of the shogunate system, where real political and military authority rested with the shogun, not the emperor. The emperor remained in Kyoto, continuing sacred rituals and symbolic governance. But actual rule belonged to the military government in Kamakura. This dual structure became a defining feature of Japanese governance. Emperor, spiritual legitimacy. Shogun, political power. And remarkably, the imperial line survived even while stripped of authority. In many other civilizations, such a shift would have ended a dynasty. In Japan, it became a permanent structure, survival through silence. The emperor as living tradition. What makes the Japanese imperial institution unique is not uninterrupted power, but uninterrupted existence. Even when emperors were controlled by regents, isolated from governance, reduced to ceremonial figures, or overshadowed by military dictators, the imperial line itself was never fully replaced. It endured through adaptation. It survived because it became more than political leadership. It became identity. It became continuity. It became Japan itself. The story of Japan's imperial dynasty shifted from divine mythology into political reality, where emperors remained sacred, but true power moved into the hands of warrior elites. The rise of the shogunate created a dual structure that would define Japan for centuries. But this system would soon be tested by forces far beyond Japan's borders. Forces that came from the largest empire the world had ever seen. and what followed would become one of the most legendary survival stories in world history. The Kamakura Shogunate, the first warrior government. After the Genpei War, Minamoto no Yoritomo established the Kamakura Shogunate, Japan's first military government. This was not just a change in leadership. It was a complete transformation of political structure. The imperial court in Kyoto remained, but it was now overshadowed by a new capital of power in Kamakura, ruled by warriors rather than aristocrats. The emperor still performed sacred rituals. He still symbolized the divine origin of the nation, but he no longer commanded armies, collected taxes, or governed provinces. Instead, Japan became a country governed by a military class that valued discipline, loyalty, and force over ritual and poetry. Yet even this warrior government could not erase the emperor. It could only rule beside him. The Hojo regent's power behind the shogun, the Minamoto shogunate itself, did not remain stable for long. After Yoritomo's death, real control shifted into the hands of the Hojo clan, who became regents to the shoguns. This created another layer in Japan's unusual political structure. Emperor in Kyoto, symbolic authority, shogun in Kamakura, military ruler Hojo, regent's actual power behind the throne. Japan was no longer governed by a single ruler, but by overlapping systems of authority. And yet through all of this complexity, the Imperial Dynasty continued untouched, not powerful, but unbroken. The Mongol threat, the greatest invasion in Japanese history. In the 13th century, a new power emerged from the Eurasian steppe, the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Kublai Khan demanded that Japan submit to his rule. The Kamakura government refused. This decision would lead to two massive invasion attempts in 1274 and 1281, events that would test Japan's survival like never before. The first invasion, 1274. Fire and steel. Arrive, the Mongol fleet, combined with Korean forces, arrived on Japan's shores with advanced military tactics, explosive weapons, and disciplined formations unlike anything Japan had seen before. Japanese samurai fought fiercely, but they were accustomed to individual combat, not coordinated battlefield warfare. The Mongols advanced rapidly, forcing Japanese defenders to retreat. But then, something unexpected happened. A storm arrived. It disrupted the fleet, forcing the invaders to withdraw. Japan had survived, but barely. The second invasion, 1281, the Divine Wind. 7 years later, Kublai Khan launched an even larger invasion force. This time, Japan prepared more extensively, building defensive walls along the coastline and organizing coordinated resistance. The Mongol fleets gathered in massive numbers. A full-scale conquest seemed inevitable. But again, nature intervened. A catastrophic typhoon struck the invading fleet. Ships were destroyed. Soldiers drowned. The invasion collapsed. The Japanese called this storm kamikaze, the divine wind. It was interpreted not as coincidence, but as spiritual protection of the nation by unseen forces tied to the imperial lineage. This belief strengthened a powerful idea. The emperor's legitimacy was protected by heaven itself. The spiritual reinforcement of the imperial throne. After the Mongol invasions, the emperor's symbolic importance grew even stronger. Even though real power remained with the shogunate, the imperial institution became deeply embedded in national identity. Japan was no longer just a land ruled by warriors. It was a land believed to be protected by divine forces connected to its imperial ancestry. This belief would have long-term consequences, because it meant that even political instability could be interpreted as part of a sacred order rather than a break from it. Decline of the Kamakura shogunate. Internal weakness. Despite surviving the Mongol threat, the Kamakura shogunate began to weaken internally. The cost of defense against the invasions drained resources. Samurai who expected rewards for their service became discontent when there were no new lands to distribute. Unlike traditional wars of conquest, defensive wars bring no spoils. This created growing economic tension within the warrior class. At the same time, rival imperial factions began to emerge, seeking to restore direct imperial rule. The system that had once stabilized Japan was now beginning to fracture under its own pressures. The Kenmu Restoration. A brief imperial revival. In the early 14th century, Emperor Go-Daigo attempted something extraordinary: to restore direct imperial rule and overthrow the shogunate system entirely. This period, known as the Kenmu Restoration, marked a rare moment where the emperor tried to reclaim real political power. For a short time, it appeared successful. The shogunate collapsed. Imperial authority was restored. But the success was temporary, because the warrior class still held the real military strength of the country, and they were not willing to surrender power. The Ashikaga shogunate power returns to the warriors. Soon after, Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful samurai leader, turned against the imperial restoration and established a new shogunate in Kyoto. This marked the beginning of the Ashikaga period. Once again, the emperor was reduced to symbolic status. Once again, military rulers controlled the state. And once again, the Imperial Dynasty survived, not by ruling, but by existing. The logic of survival, why the imperial line, endured. By this stage in history, a pattern becomes clear. Japan's Imperial Dynasty does not survive because it maintains constant power. It survives because it becomes politically useful in every system that replaces it. For aristocrats, it provides legitimacy. For shoguns, it provides divine approval. For rebels, it provides symbolic authority to justify change. The emperor becomes the one constant in a constantly changing political world. This is not strength in the traditional sense. It is endurance through adaptability. By the late 14th century, Japan had already lived through centuries of dual power, where emperors remained sacred, but shoguns ruled in practice. The Ashikaga shogunate had restored warrior control, but it never fully stabilized the country. Instead, cracks began to spread across the entire political system, and what followed would not be a controlled transition of power, but a total collapse into chaos. A period so violent and fragmented that later generations would call it the age when Japan had no center at all. This was the beginning of the Sengoku era, the weakening of Ashikaga authority. The Ashikaga shogunate ruled from Kyoto, close to the imperial court, but its control over distant provinces was fragile. Regional governors, known as daimyo, began to operate more like independent rulers than loyal officials. Over time, their allegiance to the shogunate became symbolic rather than real. Tax collection weakened. Orders from Kyoto were ignored. Military enforcement became inconsistent. Japan was still officially unified, but in practice it was drifting into fragmentation. and the emperor still in Kyoto remained a spiritual figure, respected, protected, but politically irrelevant. The center existed, but it no longer controlled the edges. The Onin War, the spark that broke Japan. In 1467, a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family triggered a conflict that would change Japan forever. This conflict became known as the Onin War. What began as a political dispute in Kyoto rapidly escalated into widespread destruction. Major samurai families chose sides, and soon the entire capital was engulfed in warfare. But the most important consequence was not the destruction of Kyoto. It was the collapse of central authority. When the war ended, there was no clear victor. The shogunate remained, but it had lost the ability to enforce its rule. From this moment onward, Japan entered an era where power belonged not to institutions, but to whoever could seize it locally. The Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, begins. The Sengoku period was not a single war. It was hundreds of overlapping conflicts across Japan. Daimyo ruled their territories like independent states. Alliances shifted constantly. Betrayals were common. Entire clans rose and fell within a single generation. Castles were built across mountains and plains. Armies expanded. Agriculture, taxation, and military systems were all redesigned for survival in constant warfare. Japan became a nation without a center. And yet, even in this chaos, the Imperial Dynasty remained in Kyoto, not ruling, not commanding, but still present. The emperor in the age of chaos. During the Sengoku era, emperors were often financially dependent on powerful warlords just to maintain the imperial court. In some cases, emperors could not even afford proper ceremonies without donations from daimyo. And yet none of the warlords replaced the emperor. They fought for land, power, and prestige, but rarely questioned the existence of the imperial institution itself. Why? Because even in chaos, the emperor represented legitimacy. No matter how strong a warlord became, claiming authority without imperial recognition remained incomplete in the cultural and political imagination of Japan. The throne had lost power, but not meaning. The rise of the great unifiers begins. Out of the chaos of Sengoku Japan, 3 figures would eventually emerge who would reshape the nation: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu. These leaders did not simply fight battles. They systematically dismantled the fractured system of competing daimyo. But their rise did not begin with unity. It began with destruction. Oda Nobunaga, the shattering of old Japan. Oda. Nobunaga was the first of the great unifiers. He used ruthless military innovation, firearms introduced from Europe, and psychological warfare to defeat rival clans. But his most radical actions were not just military, they were institutional. He destroyed fortified monasteries that held political power. He broke traditional alliances between religion and feudal authority. He centralized control through force and strategy rather than lineage. Nobunaga did not try to preserve old Japan. He tried to remake it. However, even Nobunaga never abolished the emperor. Instead, he used imperial legitimacy when it suited him, demonstrating once again the strange political duality of Japan. Power could be seized, but legitimacy still had to be inherited. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who was not born noble. After Nobunaga's death, Toyotomi Hideyoshi rose to power. Unlike most rulers of Japan's elite class, Hideyoshi was born a peasant. His rise was unprecedented in Japanese history. He continued Nobunaga's campaign of unification, eventually bringing most of Japan under centralized control for the first time in centuries. He implemented land surveys, taxation systems, and class separation laws that structured Japanese society for generations. Yet even Hideyoshi, despite his absolute power, could not become emperor. Instead, he ruled in the emperor's name. The imperial throne remained untouched, even by the man who ruled the entire country, the hidden pattern. Why no one replaced the emperor? Across centuries of war, rebellion, and political transformation, one question remained central. Why did no warlord abolish the Imperial Dynasty? The answer lies not in military weakness, but in cultural structure. The emperor was not just a ruler, he was the source of legitimacy itself. To remove the emperor would mean removing the foundation upon which all authority was justified. So instead of replacing the throne, every regime adapted around it. This made the Imperial Dynasty uniquely resilient. It survived by being above competition, not within it. By the early 17th century, Japan had endured centuries of fragmentation, civil war, and shifting power structures. The Sengoku era had nearly torn the country apart, but from its ashes emerged a new order, one built not on chaos, but on control. And at the center of this new system stood a military government that would rule Japan longer than many empires survive. This was the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, and with it came a transformation that would define Japan for over 250 years. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the final unifier. After the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan once again slipped toward instability. Rival factions competed for dominance, each claiming legitimacy over the fractured nation. The decisive conflict came in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara. Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged victorious. But unlike previous warlords who had risen through conquest, only to see their power collapse, Ieyasu did something different. He did not simply win Japan, he rebuilt it. The establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was appointed shogun, marking the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate based in Edo, modern Tokyo. This new regime brought something Japan had not experienced in over a century. Stability. But this stability came at a cost. The Tokugawa system was not just a government. It was a tightly controlled political architecture designed to prevent civil war from ever happening again. And at its center was absolute surveillance over power itself. The emperor in Edo, Japan, sacred but sealed away. During the Tokugawa era, the emperor remained in Kyoto, preserved as a sacred institution. However, his role became even more restricted than before. He did not govern. He did not command armies. He did not influence policy. Instead, the emperor became a ritual presence, carefully maintained, respected, and isolated from political affairs. The shogunate ensured that the imperial court remained stable but powerless. This was not destruction of the emperor. It was preservation through containment. The emperor became untouchable, but also unreachable. The Bakuhan system, a controlled nation. Tokugawa Japan operated under a system known as Bakuhan, combining centralized shogunal authority with semi-autonomous domains ruled by daimyo. But this autonomy was carefully restricted. The shogunate enforced strict rules. Daimyo were required to alternate residence between their domains and Edo. Their families were effectively held in Edo as political hostages. Marriage alliances required approval. Military capacity was tightly regulated. This system ensured that no regional power could grow strong enough to challenge the shogunate. Japan was unified, but not free. Stable, but tightly controlled. Sakoku, the closed country policy. One of the most defining features of Tokugawa rule was Japan's isolation from the outside world. Foreign trade and contact were severely restricted under the policy known as Sakoku. Only limited interaction was allowed with select foreign entities under strict supervision. The goal was simple: prevent external influence from destabilizing the fragile internal order. For over 2 centuries, Japan developed internally while remaining largely closed to the world. This isolation shaped its culture, economy, and identity in profound ways. And through it all, the Imperial Dynasty remained unchanged in form, a silent symbol of continuity in a carefully controlled world. Peace through control. The Edo period, stability. The Tokugawa era is often described as one of the longest periods of peace in Japanese history. War between major clans effectively ended, cities expanded, agriculture improved. A merchant class began to grow. Arts, theater, and philosophy flourished, but this peace was not accidental. It was engineered. The shogunate maintained order through strict hierarchy, surveillance, and political control. It was peace built on containment rather than freedom. The Emperor's Paradox. More sacred than ever, less powerful than ever. During this long peace, the emperor's symbolic role became even more deeply embedded in Japanese identity. Because the emperor was removed from politics, he became purely symbolic, a living embodiment of tradition, continuity, and divine legitimacy. In some ways, this made the imperial institution even stronger culturally than it had been during earlier political eras, because now the emperor was not associated with failure, war, or political disputes. He was associated with permanence. He represented Japan itself, not its government. This transformation is one of the most unusual in world history. A ruler who loses power but gains eternity. Undercurrents of change, pressure beneath the surface. Despite centuries of stability, change was slowly building beneath the surface of Tokugawa Japan. Economic pressures increased as the merchant class grew in influence. Social hierarchies became strained. Some samurai fell into poverty while others adapted to administrative roles. And most importantly, Japan was no longer fully isolated in a world that was rapidly changing. Outside its borders, industrialization and imperial expansion were reshaping global power structures. But inside Japan, the system remained rigid, designed for stability, not adaptation. This tension would eventually become impossible to contain. The fall, legacy, and enduring shadow of the Hohenzollern dynasty. The story of the Hohenzollerns does not end with triumph, nor does it conclude in the glory of empire building. Instead, it ends the way most great European dynasties eventually do, not with a sword, but with the collapse of an entire world order. For more than 800 years, the Hohenzollerns shaped the destiny of Central Europe. They rose from obscure Swabian nobles to margraves, electors, kings of Prussia, and finally German emperors. Their journey is one of discipline, militarism, ambition, and unrelenting state building. But by the early 20th century, the same forces that made them powerful would also become the seeds of their downfall. The fragile empire at its peak. At the beginning of the 1900s, the German Empire stood as one of the most powerful industrial and military states in the world. Under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm II, a member of the Hohenzollern dynasty, Germany had transformed into a global force with advanced industry, a formidable army, and a rapidly expanding navy. But beneath the surface of strength, deep cracks were forming. Wilhelm II's leadership style was erratic, impulsive, and increasingly disconnected from the political realities of Europe. Diplomacy was replaced with aggressive rhetoric. Alliances were strained. The naval arms race with Britain intensified tensions. The European balance of power, carefully maintained for decades, began to collapse. The system that the Hohenzollerns had helped build, a disciplined, centralized, militarized state, now operated on the edge of global catastrophe. The road to World War, when World War I erupted in 1914, it was not caused by a single dynasty alone, but the Hohenzollern-led German Empire played a central role in its escalation. The belief in military solution, rapid mobilization, and decisive action, all core elements of Prussian tradition, became a global inferno. At first, Germany advanced with confidence. Early victories fueled nationalist pride. But the war quickly turned into a grinding conflict of attrition. Trenches stretched across Europe. Millions of soldiers faced industrial-scale slaughter. The very idea of war changed forever. And as the war dragged on, something deeper began to collapse. Faith in the monarchy itself. By 1917 to 1918, Germany was exhausted. Food shortages, economic breakdown, and mass casualties created unrest across the empire. Workers' strikes increased. Soldiers lost morale. Political radicals gained influence. The Hohenzollern monarchy, which had once unified Prussia through iron discipline, now struggled to maintain control over a fractured nation. Inside the imperial court, advisors urged reform. But the system was too rigid, too bound by tradition, and too late to adapt. By late 1918, revolution had already begun spreading through Germany. Sailors mutinied in Kiel. Workers and soldiers formed councils. The imperial government could no longer function. The abdication of Wilhelm II. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne. He fled into exile in the Netherlands, marking the end of over 500 years of Hohenzollern rule in Brandenburg, Prussia, and 47 years of unified German Empire under their leadership. It was not a dramatic battlefield defeat, it was a political and social collapse from within. 2 days later, World War I ended. The Treaty of Versailles would formally reshape Europe, but for the Hohenzollerns, the verdict was already clear. Their imperial era was over. Exile and silence. Wilhelm II spent the rest of his life in exile at Huisdoorn in the Netherlands. Once the most powerful monarch in Europe, he lived quietly, cut off from power, reflecting on a lost empire. He never returned to Germany. He died in 1941 during another world war that Germany had once again ignited, but this time without the Hohenzollern throne. Meanwhile, the German monarchy was abolished. The Weimar Republic replaced imperial rule. Titles were legally stripped. The royal system that had defined Prussia and Germany for centuries ceased to exist. The Hohenzollern legacy. In the 20th century, even after their fall, the legacy of the Hohenzollerns did not disappear. Their influence remained embedded in Germany's institutions, a highly organized civil bureaucracy, a strong emphasis on military discipline, a tradition of centralized governance, a cultural identity shaped by Prussian efficiency. But their legacy was also controversial. The militarism associated with Prussian tradition became deeply questioned after the horrors of 2 world wars. Historians debated how much responsibility imperial structures had in shaping aggressive nationalism in Germany. The name Hohenzollern became symbolic of both state-building brilliance and imperial overreach. The modern descendants. Unlike many fallen royal families, the Hohenzollern lineage did not disappear entirely. Members of the family continue to exist in modern Germany, living as private citizens. Legal and symbolic debates over property, titles, and historical recognition continued into the 21st century. Some descendants attempted to reclaim compensation or acknowledgement for confiscated properties after the fall of monarchy. These debates often reopened old questions about history, responsibility, and memory. But politically, the dynasty no longer held any power. Their rule had become history studied, debated, and interpreted, but not continued. Why the Hohenzollerns still matter. The Hohenzollern dynasty is not just a story of kings and emperors. It is a story of how power is built, how it is maintained, and how it eventually collapses. They matter because they shaped one of the most influential states in European history, Prussia. And through Prussia, they helped create modern Germany. Their legacy forces us to confront several historical truths. Power built on discipline can create extraordinary strength. But when rigid systems fail to adapt, they can collapse with equal force. Military success can build nations, but it can also lead them into catastrophic conflicts. Centralized authority can unify fragmented regions, but it can also suppress flexibility and reform. The Hohenzollerns embody all of these contradictions. When we look back across 800 years of Hohenzollern history, we do not see a simple rise and fall. We see transformation, from medieval burgraves guarding a small castle, to electors shaping the Holy Roman Empire, to kings forging Prussia into a military machine, to emperors presiding over a unified Germany, and finally to exile and silence. Their story is not just about a family. It is about the evolution of Europe itself, from feudal fragmentation to the modern nation-states, from dynastic rule to democratic systems, from swords to industry, and from empires to republics. The Hohenzollerns are gone from power, but not from history, because history does not forget the families who helped build the world we live in, even when their thrones have long turned to dust. And so the final question remains not about what they lost, but about what they left behind. A legacy of greatness, a legacy of conflict, and a legacy that continues to shape Europe even today.